Thank you all very much for the opportunity to be part of this launch event. The topic will change pretty dramatically from the last presentation, but hopefully it will fit the general objectives of where you're going. I'm going to focus on data and governance gaps in the context of achieving land degradation neutrality, which is integral to SDG target 15.3 on life on land. Let's see if I can advance the slide. So the context here is that land underpins almost every SDG, every sustainable development goal, and it certainly is relevant for all the environmental objectives, climate change, biodiversity, pollution, etc. And we're basically running out of it. We have almost all of it already converted for human use, at least a very large majority, and 1 in 5 of those hectares is no longer useful for its intended purpose. So we're burning the candle at both ends, and we're basically taking away the carbon sink that land represents, and we're losing biodiversity on top of the fact that land is essential for the livelihoods of all of us. You can see from what the Intergovernmental Platform on Ecosystem Services and Biodiversity, IPBES, demonstrated the relationship between all SDGs and land, and in particular, land that is degrading or needs to be addressed that way. It obviously is one of the planetary SDGs, and it's arguable because it represents over 95% of our food supply. It's critical that we address the land side of this. It's also important to recognize that there are interactions in both directions. So our influence, land degradation not only contributes to the climate change problem, reducing our ability to mitigate or adapt, but also climate change accelerates land degradation. So the synergies among the SDGs are good, but these SDGs compete for the same land resources. This study was done before many of the SDGs actually reported data, but nevertheless, the indicators underneath these SDGs, but nevertheless, the numbers still hold. And it's interesting if you take the pairwise comparison of each SDG, you'll find that there are, like there is here with SDG on life on land, this balance between synergies and trade-offs. If we look at the synergies among SDGs that are the strongest, they're not surprising. So obviously poverty and education are related in a good way, but the trade-offs should not be surprising either. You'll notice SDG 15 and SDG 12, which is on sustainable consumption and production, show up in the top 10 trade-offs pretty consistently. And it makes a lot of sense because basically that consumption is driving the degradation that we have on land. So we've got a very big problem in that regard. So how can we navigate these trade-offs? Well, we have to think much more holistically than we have in the past. We need a balanced approach that both anticipates new degradation and considers the trade-offs among competing interests across the landscape. This sounds straightforward, but it's actually not done from a scientific point of view, from a data point of view, from a technology point of view. It's not the way we approach land. It's the way we approach climate. It's the way we approach biodiversity, but we've got a long way to go with the land side of it. That changed between 2012 at what was called Rio plus 20, or 20 years after the Rio conventions were negotiated, and all the way up to 2015 when the UNCCD, the UN Convention on Combating Desertification, actually adopted the concept of land degradation neutrality and this definition. And you'll notice in the definition, it's about environment, it's about food, it's about all ecosystem services derived from land. And the scientific framework that was developed following the agreement on the definition makes it clear that what we're trying to maintain by pursuing a neutrality approach to land degradation is the natural capital and all the ecosystem services that flow from it. Or in other words, if we want to prevent no additional harm in net terms for each land type or each ecosystem type between now, and now was essentially 2015, through to 2030, then we're actually talking about keeping everything in balance. It means we accept that there will be some new degradation, but we need to prevent it as much as possible through conservation. We need to have sustainable practices where we already are using land, and we need a very large investment in ecological rehabilitation and restoration. If we do these things simultaneously, we can keep land in balance and thereby food, water, carbon, biodiversity, etc., in balance. It means that our focus shifts from what we do on land to the land use decisions process, which has not been the focus of the majority of investment over the past few decades. It's a very big change in mindset. It ultimately means, if you want to define LDN, it's about doing the right things in the right places at the right scale. And underneath that is data. It's driven by data, or it must be. It also involves a hierarchy, one that basically says prevention is better than the cure. So it's really important to figure out where we can avoid degradation up front. It's a lot less expensive to do that than it is to restore land. It also recognizes that data inform learning. So very much in the past, our approach to monitoring across the conventions was essentially punitive, right? Are we doing it right or wrong? But the argument here is by the time we monitor land degradation, we're too late. The land has already been converted and we've got a serious problem. So rather, we should be using data to learn and inform decision processes. I'm not saying that we shouldn't also track how well we're doing. Of course we should, but that's minor compared to preventing the problem. So in the UNCCD approach, it's essentially an essential variables approach, because back in 2008, the convention conducted a study of what people were using in every country in the world to monitor land degradation. 1,500 unique indicators. Why? Because degradation varies significantly by location to location. So what needs to be measured changes. So the convention said at the national to global level, we need to be much more simple. Just have a few indicative things to monitor that give us, lick 3 fingers, put them in the air, get a sense of how we're doing, point the direction nationally, but then have a comprehensive approach nationally to locally where all indicators can come into play. So what do we actually ask countries to monitor at the national to global level? Basically, it's 3 indicators, and they're all trends-based. Trends in land cover change is the transformational variable, and it's key because if we can prevent that land conversion, we're making a very large step in the right direction. We also have an indicator, which is the most common indicator for assessing land degradation, which is about productivity, and it varies from yield to NPP, lots of ways of monitoring productivity. But the national to global level, we take a Earth observation approach, and we do it in a standardized way, which I'll mention a little bit more detail in a moment. It's not a simple thing to measure, and everyone's approach varies a little bit. So this is a challenge for the Earth observation community. It also has more dimensions based on the graph I just showed you, and these three elements, trend, state, and performance, that contribute to monitoring productivity. And then and by the way, the productivity is the fast ecological variable. It's the most influenced by factors that are not related to land degradation, such as increases in precipitation. So we must have a slow ecological variable in the mix, and it's the holy grail. If we could monitor soil organic carbon, we could tell a large part of the story. Very difficult to do at any scale, but certainly the national to global level is challenging. But what we know is if we don't have soil organic carbon in the soil, then essentially the soil is dead. So we've got no biodiversity in it and very unlikely biodiversity in any significant way above ground. It also means that that carbon is in the atmosphere rather than where it should be, which is in the soil and vegetation. We take a trends approach here, but we do the best we can. And Earth observation community certainly can contribute to doing better than we can today. And the best we can at the again, national to global level has to do with standards that are already applied in the IPCC guidelines, a tiered approach to make it accessible for country parties. It's ultimately, we would like to move this all the way in to land management, and ultimately we'd like to look at carbon stocks below and above ground in an integrated way. It's possible to do both, but rarely in a clearly integrated way. The combination makes up SDG indicator 15.3.1, and we integrate these in the most conservative integration method, which is called one out, all out, that basically says if any of those three indicators shows degradation, meaning a loss, significant negative change, then that pixel, that location, is considered degraded. We also have a very open approach where it comes to tool development and providing countries the capacity to manipulate default data sets provided by major entities like ESA, NASA, et cetera, so that we can allow countries the ability to bring in their own interpretation, their own data sets, and compare them to those default data sets and make the best decision on what to report to be representative of that country. This has been done through a collaboration with Conservation International and a tool that you may have come across called Trends.Earth, which on the surface is a plugin to QGIS, and at the back end, a strong use of Google Earth Engine. This allows us at the country level the ability to basically recalculate national data sets using global standards required for the SDGs so that we can have countries report in a harmonized way if they choose to use other than the default data sets, which is quite common. How do we then therefore move from choosing the best data set or tool to mobilizing all of you, the entire Earth observation community? We do this under the umbrella of the GEO through an initiative called the GEO-LDN initiative, and that allows us to pursue harmonized standards in a collaborative way among all entities. It also puts us in the position to look at capacity development needs, data quality standards, and data analytics, or the tool development, again, in a way that leads to collaboration rather than competition among data providers and those that are producing these powerful tools. This allows us to meet the mandate given to us by parties, which actually says we want a globally standardized approach and we want country ownership simultaneously. These don't always agree, but through Trends.Earth and this ability to incorporate standards, we move in both directions in a positive way. And those minimum data quality standards, we've done a significant kind of user-centered approach with data providers to move towards minimum data quality standards. We've done the same thing on the tool development side through a competition that allowed basically a lot of organizations to recognize the power of this kind of collaboration. On the data side, this resulted in good practice guidance, which is the SDG terminology for the common methodology. And I urge you to take a look at this to see how what you're doing already does, or might in the future fit in. That national ownership is key because it empowers countries to do it themselves. And that capacity varies significantly across the globe. But through the analytical approach, through the tool development approach, we're making strong progress in that development of capacity. Once countries are done manipulating data through Trends.Earth, they're in the position to move that data across the firewall, if you will, into the official space of national reporting, which in the UNCCD is a tool called Praise.4. Praise4. It's the fourth iteration of our reporting process, and it's geospatial in nature, and it allows us to move from simply allowing countries to fulfill their mandate through reporting to moving basically 196 unique data sets that come into a place where we can actually tell the world, well, what do governments feel the story is about land degradation? So to do that, we need obviously permission from countries to use those data sets that are submitted. And the default is essentially one that follows the fair practices and Creative Commons licensing to create a balance. But of course, it's the choice of countries. So we obviously want an approach that is common, that is technically open, and as legally open as possible. And we use that Creative Commons base to start from, and then let the country make their decisions. It's implemented inside the Praise platform through you'll see in a moment, a drop-down process where they can select the license approach most applicable for their legal circumstances in their country. And then once the data are reported, we can then aggregate and share this data at a global level. So where do we need your help when we think about data and this concept of governance? Well, the bottom line, as I mentioned before, is monitoring is not enough. And if it's not enough, where does governance from the perspective of land intersect with the governance I've mentioned before on the data side of this? Well, land degradation neutrality comes with a set of guiding principles. If you know a little bit about no net loss approaches, think of these as accounting rules. And many of them are based on what are called the VGGTs, the voluntary guidelines on tenure, which are critical because if tenure is safeguarded, many other things can happen, but only if we look at all the principles. And I've circled some of those that relate to the human side of this. There are also some that talk about protecting the environment. This is about engaging people in the governance process. And the voluntary guidelines have been, in the last 2 years, integrated with LDN so that we can actually provide countries with a set of options, pathways, if they are moving towards this more safeguarded tenure approach. But I put the emphasis now back on land use planning. And that's key for the Earth observation community, because ultimately integrating economic, social, and environmental demands for land is about data, and it's about understanding the underlying land potential for every land use decision. Let me put it a different way. If you're following the post-2020 global biodiversity framework process, you'll realize that there is a very important need to look at corridors between protected areas. It's the space between sustainable use, where we've already converted the land, and those protected areas, and linking the biodiversity between them. But where do we put that biodiversity corridor? Where is the optimal location? You may know that a few years ago, a major global scientific study demonstrated that biodiversity immediately outside protected areas is greater than biodiversity inside protected areas. Does that mean that we have failed in our attempt to locate those protected areas? You could argue that, but you could also argue that that was the opportunity at the time, right? Protect whatever we possibly can and move forward from there. But we're past that stage now. We need to put the food, the climate change mitigation plantations, bioenergy, whatever it might be, relative to nature in the most optimal configuration going forward. That means data. That means understanding the underlying land potential. It also means the assessment of resilience, because all of these major initiatives through the multilateral development banks, through the World Bank, the GEF, et cetera, are fundamentally resilience-based. That means we've got to, and so is land degradation neutrality. That means we have to provide a lot of information to the project developers in order to optimize what they do where, using tools such as RAPTA, a strong example, but there are others that are out there. It also means putting them in the position to navigate the actual trade-offs. And that means tools. This is the example of LUTO, where we can look at land use trade-offs. The most famous tool, of course, is CLUE, which is often used at the national and even to global level. But we need these tools in every land use planning process. And there are many, far more than those more macro tools that I have just showed to you that need to be integrated. It also, from a governance point of view, means doing something we very rarely do with environmental data, and that is create the possibility for disaggregation across gender boundaries. This is not simple because biophysical data and where people live are rarely integrated in a way that allows us to do this, but we must take these steps forward. And to finish up, I'd just like to give you a quick feel, where are we now? So from the point of view of reporting for the first time on SDG 15.3.1, which took place in 2019, it demonstrated that 1 in 5 hectares degradation assessment that we're talking about. And you'll notice that it looks like everybody reported, but actually, of these 169 countries that reported, a number of them provided estimates. The total number that are actually legally pursuing this, the map looks more like this. This is the countries that are formally pursuing LDN targets. You'll notice Europe is not showing up, except for Italy, is not showing up in the color of contributing. However, almost all of those countries, and actually all of the countries in the world now, are actually embracing this. They provide estimates to the SDG process, but they haven't necessarily embraced it legally for many different reasons, country by country. From the perspective of global ambition, going back a slide, LDN actually represents half of the 1 billion hectares contributed to restoration. Restoration defined from conservation through sustainable use to that ecological rehabilitation and restoration. The NDCs from climate change represent a chunk, similar in the Biodiversity Convention, and also for deforestation, the Bond Challenge. All of these together have a common platform. All of them ultimately contribute to LDN because they meet the principles. But moving from commitments to action really depends on you and your efforts to not only produce the data sets, but to put them in the hands of planners, to put them into the process of where these decisions will be made. And that is the end of this presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Barron. Okay, Barron, we have a lot of questions and only a few minutes left. So everyone, please take a second and rate the questions that you want answered. I think we'll be able to get through one or two of them. I can read out the first one. We have 3 votes. It says, Barron, how could projects such as Land Carbon Lab and Open Earth Monitor best support LDN initiatives, especially in terms of open geodata on mobile phones?
That's a great question. So 3-part answer. First of all, embrace the GeoLDN initiative, even if only part-time. Engage, because there, what you can provide will become known to all of us that are trying to employ what you can provide. That's number one. The tool that has fully embraced this is called, that's mobile, is called Land PKS. And it's open and it's already linked to Trends.Earth, etc. So maybe we can find synergies there for what you're considering and what's already being done with that platform. Again, the API side of this is key. We're not asking you to embrace a tool. We're asking you to make your tool embraceable, whatever it may be. Thanks.
Great, thank you. That was very concise. So I think we have time for one more. We have a few votes on this next question. It says, how do the LDN indicators account for avoidance of land degradation? Conservation efforts show up as neutral rather than contributing to LDN.
Well, they do and they don't. Just think of it this way. If a conservation measure was implemented after 2015 and it works, then it's going to show up as gains. So first of all, that is a contribution. In addition, all conservation that was implemented prior to 2015, at minimum, won't get worse. And stability is a major part of contributing to LDN. So actually, we have a very large effort to try and encourage everything on the conservation side. So actually, it's more about strategy. Where will we conserve next? Is it optimal? Does it make room for all the other land uses that also must be addressed if we meet all the SDGs? This is where we think the effort needs to go, integrated land use planning.
Great, and we have one more very popular question that I want to try to squeeze in here. How important is open data to UNCCD, especially considering not all of the sources are open data licensed?
Absolutely right. It's essential. The more open that the data providers can be, the more possible it is for integration, harmonization, etc. We're not trying to lock anything down fully, but obviously, the more disparate the approach is, the more difficult it is for comparability. We're not looking for comparability to punish. We're looking comparability to learn so that we can actually move the agenda forward. And to go back to the first question, and this one is actually to all 3 questions, there is a blended finance, an innovative blended finance approach called the the LDN Fund. The LDN Fund, through IDH, which is based in the Netherlands, created a methodology that links this national to global approach that I've already shared with you for those that are trying to look at compliance nationally to locally. It would be very powerful for that because it is already done a lot of the groundwork of how to link these to build off of that for the project level. That could make a very big difference for the UNCCD, for our parties, and for project developers. Thank you.
Thank you.